I think everybody was pretty shocked this morning in court when Tim Hickerson was let out on bond. Because remember, this was a bond appeal. He was denied bond down in district court last week. So this commenter is asking, how in the heck did he get bond if they have evidence that he murdered Shane? I only just listened to Shane's OG podcast after his arrest. Remember, we originally covered this story back in 2020 during season 1 of our show. And after Tim Hickerson's arrest, we re-released that episode and did an update episode. She said, I suspected him just with that limited info. And what I will say about that is Tim Hickerson has been, the main person of interest in this case since the very beginning. And that's something that his own lawyer will admit to. And in fact, he does talk about that in his motion for bond. So before we get into all that, let's just talk about court this morning. Tim came in, if you remember from his mugshot, this is what he looked like when he was arrested. Since he's been incarcerated, which has been just about 2 months exactly, he's gotten a goatee and his hair is growing in. I don't know if that's an effort to soften his appearance or what, but there were a couple big points that the defense wanted to get through today in the hearing. And the first one that they focused on was whether or not Tim Hickerson is a flight risk. Because if you remember, and you go back to my video last week about when he was initially denied bond, that was the main reasoning that judge gave, which is that she believed he was a flight risk. And my personal opinion was that was actually the weakest argument in denying him bond. I mean, you could say the severity of charges, any number of things, but he didn't strike me as a flight risk. And I do believe that the issue of the flight risk came back to the thing that we've been talking about over and over again, which is this perception that Tim Hickerson was fighting extradition, which, the prosecution saying he did, Flagler County, Florida saying he did, Tim Hickerson, his lawyers are saying he did not. And they brought that up again today. His attorney said that it was a miscommunication between Tim and his lawyer down in Florida. He did not want to fight extradition. Mr. Hickerson never had any intention of fighting extradition or attempting to avoid returning to the Commonwealth. Now, in addition to being a flight risk, the other factors that go into whether or not somebody is granted bond are whether or not this person poses an unreasonable danger to himself, others, or the community at large. And they point out in the motion that this statute, the Virginia Code, is presumptively in favor of release, particularly after recent legislative amendments remove the presumptions against bond. So it's kind of saying, you're innocent till proven guilty, and that same thought process should apply to bond as well. So we're not trying to prove why they should get bond, you're kind of more trying to prove why they shouldn't. The defense then went on to say that, look, Tim was dealing with drugs at the time of Shane's disappearance. He was a very different person. We all know he was arrested very shortly after this for robbing a gun store and served 4 years in federal prison. But his lawyer kept on saying, look, he is a changed man. He got clean in prison and he has had 0 issues in the decade since then. Then he brought up the main thrust of the defense's argument, which is that the vast majority of the evidence that the Commonwealth has is 14 years old. And so he called the evidence circumstantial and stale. And he said, if Tim Hickerson confessed to burglarizing Shane's home, as the prosecution contends he did 14 years ago, then why wasn't he arrested 14 years ago? And back to the part where I was talking about how, Tim's side absolutely acknowledges that he has always been the main suspect in this. In the motion, he says, we understand that Mr. Hickerson has been a person of interest in this case for over a decade. He was interviewed multiple times beginning in 2010. He knows his friends and family have been interviewed and properties have been searched. Despite this, he has not fled, has not attempted to impede the investigation or intimidate potential witnesses. all of which he could have done over the last 14 years. And then they said he is eager to put this matter to a resolution once and for all. His family still lives in this community, and he knows full well and appreciates that it is simply time for this matter to be resolved one way or another. And that is what I've been hearing from Tim's family, and I think that's just the general sentiment. It's been 14 years. It's too long. We need some sort of resolution. Then the prosecution got up, and I was really expecting to hear more details of the evidence that they had, just to really hammer home why Tim Hickerson should not get bond. But most of what she said is just what was said in the initial bond hearing. She did say a few new things, which is that Shane was Tim's drug dealer, which is the first time that's been specifically said in court. It's been implied, but she came out and said that today. She then reiterated that when being interviewed about Shane's disappearance, Tim said that he owed Shane $500 for drugs and that he went to Shane's house on March 20th, 2010 to steal pills and party and get high with his friend Craig. She then went over again how Tim panicked because he had buried Shane's gun near an abandoned truck on the Hickerson farm, but he couldn't find it to get rid of it before the property was searched because he buried it when he was high and didn't remember where it was. Then she kind of went after the Hickersons, which is not something that she did in the last bond hearing, because the defense's whole plan is for Tim to go live with his parents while he's awaiting trial and work with his brother. They all still live in Nokesville. They all live close to the original Hickerson farm, and that is where Tim lived for his entire life up until this 14 years ago. So the prosecution went in on the Hickersons and said that they were obstructionists, that's her word, during the search and restricted, and this is the search that took place in April of 2010, and restricted where police were and were not able to go. Then there was a new extensive search just in September of this year that lasted several days, and she said that Tim's aunt came there and tried to block the search. But, she didn't have the legal standing to do so. So the search still happened. They said that police found the truck and that there were holes in the ground nearby, indicating that something could have been dug up. She also said that Tim made a jailhouse call to his wife and said, hey, what are you going to do about the things in the closet? And they're trying to kind of talk in code, but basically they were talking about guns. They later found out from his wife. They had guns in the closet and they wanted to get rid of them. Because remember, Tim's a convicted felon and shouldn't be around guns. So then in another jailhouse phone call with his father, Mr. Hickerson, said that he had gone down and taken care of it, but he couldn't really get into what he took care of because, and this is what the prosecutor said in quote, the Nazi motherfuckers are listening. So then she was saying that, Tim still has access to guns if he's going to be released, and that Tim and his family represents risk and concern with witnesses and concern with potential evidence that could still be on or near the property. When the defense got back up, they said a few things about, how they don't believe this whole gun story and how they just don't really think that there's much evidence to find. And he said, quote, what they were looking for wasn't going to be found because it doesn't exist. Then, with no explanation as to his reasoning, the judge said that he is setting bond at $50,000 and that he's not allowed to have guns, drugs, he must live with his parents and have GPS monitoring. So that's what happened today. What are your thoughts?